Hello, this video is about the Articles of Confederation, our very first form of government. And as we go through this, I'm going to be using a book called A Brilliant Solution by Carol Birkin that is all about the Constitution. It has some great stories throughout that. So I'm going to share some stories as we go along as well. So the year was 1786. It was the 10th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the third year of life in a new nation. But political leaders everywhere feared that there was little cause to celebrate. Dark clouds and a suffocating gloom seemed to have settled over the country, and these men understood that something had gone terribly wrong. From his plantation in Virginia, George Washington lamented the steady stream of diplomatic humiliation suffered by the young republic. Fellow Virginian James Madison talked gravely of mortal diseases afflicting the Confederacy. In New Jersey, William Livingston confided to a friend his doubt that the Republic would survive another decade. From Massachusetts, the bookseller turned revolutionary strategist Henry Knox declared, "Our present federal government is a name, a shadow, without power or effect." There were a number of different problems that had been occurring throughout the republic, so to speak, that gave them major pause for concern. First of all, when they broke free of England, they gained their own country. However, they had no protection on the high seas anymore. And we'll talk a little bit about how that is going to play out later. As an independent America, they had the ability to trade with whoever they want, but they lost the guaranteed British Caribbean markets for their products. So that hurt them. There was also no well trained military to defend them against natives out on the western frontier. And a post war economic depression had settled in both the South and in New England. Farmers scrambled to make mortgage payments, and when they could not, this led to foreclosures and evictions. Then Vermont gets fed up with New York, particularly the Vermont farmers, and demands its own statehood be recognized. Again, backcountry farmers rose up in armed rebellion. State rivalries between the different states that didn't see each other as a common country, but as competition, led to trade barriers and tariffs, which are taxes on imported goods. And each state had its own currency. So if you were a merchant that was trying to trade with different states, you had to exchange your own currency. So it was causing a lot of problems at the time. The Articles of Confederation themselves allowed for the government to borrow money, to make treaties, declare war, deal with Indians, control Western lands, deal with foreign problems, and run the postal service. However, it did not have an executive branch or a single leader like a president, had no judicial branch for settling disputes. That meant no courts. It could not levy taxes, meaning that if it needed money to be able to run the country, they had to beg states to give them money. And you can probably guess how many of those states were willing to hand over very much money. The same problem with the army. Even though they could deal with foreign problems and control Western lands, they couldn't force anyone to join the army. They had to beg people from these different states to send troops. And they could not regulate trade, either interstate, as we saw it's causing problems, or even foreign. Here is a cartoon that I found on the Articles of Confederation that no president, no executive agencies, no judiciary, no tax base, no army funding, no navy funding, weak foreign policy, no trade policy. What were we thinking? And here's the poor Articles of Confederation saying, but it wasn't all bad. And we'll see that in a minute. So here again are some of the specific weaknesses that you need to know. Is each state, regardless of its size, had just one single vote. So here is little old New Hampshire, which was a small state at the time, that gets one vote, and big Virginia that gets one vote. And so there was nothing to make it so that states that had larger populations had more power. And in order to pass a law, 9 of 13 states had to approve the proposal. That was very difficult to get accomplished. And this final one was even more. There was no way to amend this Articles of Confederation because all states had to agree. And I don't know many situations in life where you can get 100% of people to agree, let alone something like this, when you have these states that really are more about themselves and really don't see a national government as what this has been created. In fact, they call themselves a loose friendship of states. And it was really built so that there was more power to the states and a very weak central government. So the national government could not collect taxes, as I already mentioned. They had to ask individual states for money. There were both national and state currencies. So there's money is constantly changing, and you can see down at the bottom are two examples of money from different places. In addition, each state could regulate trade with other states, and they could have different rules. So if you were trying to trade, you never knew which state you had which rules with. Each state could tax its own residents, and only the states could establish militias. But remember, I said it wasn't all bad. So they did accomplish a couple of really significant and important things. Number one was the peace treaty with Great Britain. This is also known as the Treaty of Paris of 1783. It's extremely important when you see the Treaty of Paris that you look at the date to know what it's talking about, because that treaty that ended the French and Indian War was also called the Treaty of Paris, but it was 1763. And there's going to be other treaties of Paris and treaties of Versailles throughout history. The second thing is the Land Ordinance of 1785. They have acquired all this new land out in the Northwest Territory, but they don't really have a way to divide it up. So this is going to specifically draw it up and figure out how they're going to parcel off and sell this land. And they also, this is something huge. In a previous video, I showed you how much extra land some of the states had than they do now. Somehow they managed to have those states give up their claims to Western land. So that's not insignificant. And finally, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 set up a system by which new states could be added, because they realized that the original 13 states were not going to be the only states ever to be added. And here I'll give you a second to take a look at the Northwest Ordinance and this area where they are going to create these new states out of, and they're going to make the division. So you may be asking, why did they make the articles so weak? If clearly this government is not able to function properly, why on earth would they do that? So if you go back to thinking about what we didn't like about the British, we didn't like the fact that they taxed us without our representation. So we decided to make sure the federal government couldn't tax us at all. So it swings all the way to the other extreme. The concern had been that the large central government or the monarchy had all the power, and so they made sure that states didn't have to follow laws or treaties. The states always had to listen to the king under the British model, and so now they had states that could have their own laws and didn't have to follow any other state's laws. All the power was in the king's hands, so they made sure not to have a king again by making sure there was no executive branch or national court system. And the king could change the system of government anytime he wanted to, for whatever reason. And any amendment required all 13 states, as I mentioned. So they made it pretty much impossible for that to happen. And you can see the problem. There's also going to be some foreign problems. And we will start by mentioning the fact that there are Barbary pirates. And so these are individuals in the Mediterranean, and they're going to humiliate the American merchant marine. Without the protection of the British Navy, American vessels carrying wheat and flour to southern European markets became easy prey for Barbary Coast pirates. In 1785, the Dey of Algiers seized the American ship, confiscated its cargo, and imprisoned its crew. When ransom demands arrived, Congress could not meet the captor's price. Crew and captain languished in prison, victims of one government's greed and another's poverty. When the ruler of Tripoli offered to ensure safe passage to all American ships for a price, Congress could not raise the protection money. By 1786, the survival of this valuable trade route was in question. So remember, why they can't raise the money to protect and to get our sailors out of this mess is because they didn't have the power to tax. Next, Spain decided to close the port of New Orleans to shipping in order to slow the influx of Americans into the territory adjoining and overlapping Louisiana. The Confederation recognized the crisis that would follow. Without a gateway to the ocean, settlers coming to Kentucky and Tennessee would be cut off from much needed supplies and deprived of any access to markets for their crops. Yet American ambassadors could make no headway in persuading Spain to reopen the port, for they had no leverage in negotiations. As Westerners' confidence in the Confederation faded, they devised their own solutions. One frontier entrepreneur went so far as to sign a loyalty oath to the Spanish government in exchange for trade concessions. So things are not going well with Spain. And of course, the British openly defied the terms of the Paris Peace Treaty by refusing to evacuate the Ohio Valley forts. Their continued presence was an affront to American sovereignty, but it was also a real threat to peacetime on the frontier. Commanders in these forts operated as agents provocateurs, providing Ohio Valley Indians with encouragement, arms, and ammunition as they mounted organized resistance to American settlement. The Spanish offered the same encouragement and aid to the Choctaw, Creek, and Cherokee along the southern frontier. The Confederation could do little to force the British out or to prevent either foreign nation from abetting and aiding the Indians. Britain's firm quid pro quo for giving up the western forts was the repayment of American planters and merchants of personal debts to the British creditor and the compensation to loyalists for confiscated property, meaning that Britain agreed that we will give up our western forts when and only when you have paid the personal debts of these British creditors and compensated loyalties for property that you had taken during the American Revolution. But again, Congress had no money to cover these debts or obligations itself, and it had no means to prevent state legislatures from obstructing the collection of pre-war debts. The Confederation also had no military clout either, with a peacetime army of fewer than 700. 700! Think about that. Poorly equipped soldiers, it could not drive the British out nor quell the violence on the frontier. Thus, when Southern tribes threatened to mount a full-scale war, Georgia and North Carolina took matters into their own hands. Both states undercut the authority of the national government by negotiating independent treaties with Indians on their borders. So as you can see, things are not going well foreign policy-wise. And then domestically, economy in the 1780s, the Americans are suffering from a depression. There's huge national and state debts that were left from the Revolution with no way to pay them. The excessive use of credit to purchase consumer goods after the war had caused debt problems. There was a lack of currency that plagued the states. Foreclosures on farms increased as farmers could not pay debts. Inflation was running away and things were so expensive that nobody could afford them. And British companies flooded America with goods at very low prices, which meant that American companies could not compete at these low prices. So, really, meanwhile, in Congress, morale is low. All too rapidly, the Confederation had sunk into practical paralysis. By the fall of 1785, attendance at congressional sessions was already embarrassingly low. Throughout the winter and spring of 1786, absences reached crisis proportions. Quorums could barely be met, and the business of Congress, limited though it was rapidly coming to a halt. Tired of dealing with problems they could not solve, congressmen from every state preferred to stay home. Who could blame them? Every day, Congress faced a host of angry creditors, foreign and domestic, clamoring for repayment of wartime loans. But the federal treasury was empty, and Congress had no means to fill it. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress's only source of revenue was the generosity of states. When the states proved cavalier, if not derelict in their support, the federal government could do nothing. In Paris, London, Madrid, and Amsterdam, American diplomats found it impossible to negotiate new loans, for no one was willing to lend money to a nation that could not honor its existing debts. Veterans who held government certificates, widows who had lent their small fortunes to the war effort, and wealthy speculators who had gambled on the government retiring its debt were all losing faith in a government that turned out empty pockets to its creditors. The Confederation devised two creative plans to solve its financial problems. Both failed. So this is where we are at when a very important event begins to happen, and that is Shays' Rebellion. And really, you could see it as the idea that it almost was a moment of fortune for the individuals who were looking at everything that was going on with the nation and realizing that a strong central government was needed. And so this is going to happen in Springfield, Massachusetts, when 600 desperate farmers will storm the courthouse there. The trouble had been brewing for some time, ever since the return of peace brought with it an economic depression in the western counties of the state. Many of these farmer rebels, armed with pitchforks and old muskets, were in danger of losing their farms to creditors. Since 1783, they had watched helplessly as their property taxes rose and their profits declined. As the wealthy Bostonians who held the mortgages on their land went to court to begin foreclosing proceedings, the farmers saw their future slipping away. For months, they sought relief through political channels, petitioning the state assembly to issue paper money, to lower taxes, to approve stay laws that would temporarily prevent the courts from acting on the foreclosure demands. The state government, however, turned a deaf ear. Dominated by hard money men and mortgage holders, it refused to provide any relief to these in debt. In August of 1786, the farmers decided to take matters into their own hands. The government, they said, had turned its back on the people, and the people no longer owed such a government any loyalty. This was rhetoric familiar to all Americans, torn straight from the pages of John Locke and the Declaration of Independence. The farmers struck the first blow against the new tyranny by blocking the entrance to the Court of Common Pleas at Northampton, preventing lawyers and judges from entering. Within days, the farmers' revolt had spread. Reports of court closings came from Worcester, Concord, Taunton, and as far north as Great Barrington. But the heart of the rebellion seemed to be in Springfield, where a 39-year-old Pelham veteran of the Battle of Saratoga named Daniel Shays led some 1,500 men in an assault on the courthouse. Dressed in their old Continental Army uniforms, sporting sprigs of hemlock in their hats, just as the Continental soldiers had once done, Shays' makeshift army seized and occupied the courthouse on September 25th. A frightened Massachusetts government took steps to restore law and order. The governor called up an impressive force of over 4,400 militiamen, and General Benjamin Lincoln, a veteran like Shays of Saratoga, was appointed to lead this army against the rebels. The end came quickly. On February 3rd, 1787, Lincoln surprised and routed the farmers. A general amnesty, or forgiveness, was issued, and although Shays and the 13 of his followers were tried and convicted, Governor John Hancock thought it best to pardon them. The rebellion sent shockwaves across the nation and across the ocean. Thomas Jefferson, who was serving as the American ambassador to France, was one of a few Americans who refused to be alarmed by the uprising. Writing to James Madison from Paris on January 30th, Jefferson declared that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. And this is a very famous quote for him. Madison emphatically did not agree. Neither did the Chief Justice of Massachusetts, William Cushing, who spoke for many of Boston's most prominent former revolutionaries when he pronounced the leaders of the rebellion to be evil-minded persons, demagogues, and rabble-rousers who were ignorant, unprincipled, bankrupt, and desperate. Even Samuel Adams, one of the earliest and most devoted champions of revolution, condemned the rebels. There was no moral connection, he insisted, between the American Revolution and their revolt. Rebellion against a king may be pardoned, he declared, but the man who dares to rebel against the laws of a republic ought to suffer death. Men more distant from the scene responded to news of Shays' rebellion with anguish rather than anger. I am mortified beyond expression, wrote George Washington, calling the revolt a triumph for the advocates of despotism. But in truth, the most powerful emotion stirred in the breasts of planters and wealthy merchants by Shays' rebellion was fear. How many more evil-minded persons stood ready to stir up the discontent and despair of farmers, slaves, and urban debtors? Only a strong and energetic government could stand in the way of what these men of property labeled anarchy. It was a sobering realization, and it was one that played into the hands of the Nationalists in 1787 began. So, to recap here, what I had read from the book is the idea that the most concerning aspect of this rebellion was the fact that there probably were many more individuals like Daniel Shays ready to stir up outright rebellion against the government. And as George Washington and others expressed, there was real fear that the government was not strong enough to handle this, and that this little experiment in government that they had was soon going to fall apart. And so here is just a quick little synopsis of this, of Western farmers dealing with high taxes. Massachusetts law said you can't pay your taxes, you go to jail and you lose your property. Daniel Shays leads the men to an arsenal, which is a storage of weapons. Federal troops can't help, and it shows the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. So to end, there was a realization that this needed to be fixed. During the war and after, under the new government, most people still saw themselves based on their state as either Virginians or South Carolinians, rather than as Americans. And the states had almost all the power, and this national government, with all the specific things that were put in, had no way to deal with the problems. And so they decided to call a convention to fix the articles. Notice the key word here is to fix the articles. And instead, they, under absolute silence and secrecy, decided that it was not fixable and decided to throw it out completely. And that's how we get the Constitution, which is in another video. Thank you very much.